Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Learn French with Madame. So today we're going to talk about GER and CER verbs. So I first off on my sheet of paper drew out two tables and I wrote the verbs manger and commencer. Those are the two verbs that I want to use as examples today to talk about GER and CER verbs. Now, before we get started, it's helpful to know the endings for ER verbs because 90% of this you already know. Really, with GER and CER verbs, we only need to talk about what happens in the new form with our new ending. So before I get started, I'm going to go through and I'm going to circle or highlight my new form box because that's super important and I don't want to forget about it. So I'm just going to go through and put a yellow box around the new form. If you have a highlighter, you can follow along and do the same thing. If you don't have a highlighter, that's okay. You can just put a star around it or put a box around it in any old color. It doesn't matter. I just like to use yellow because I feel like it helps me make sure it stands out. All right, so now that we've got our box, let's start with the verb manger. I'm going to start with that verb. Now we should remember that the verb manger means to eat. So as always, I'm going to start off with writing out what my verb means. So we have manger means to eat. Now we need to follow the same steps as we would with any old ER verb in order to conjugate this. So the first thing that we're going to do is take off our ER ending. So we're going to take off our ER ending and we're going to write down our stem for all 6 forms. So I'm going to write down my stem for all 6 forms. You can follow along on a sheet of paper if you'd like. All right, now that I have all of my 6 forms written down, I need to go through and write my endings. So I'm going to go through and write my endings in red. And they're just like regular ER verbs, except we're going to skip the new form for right now. So remember with ER verbs, we add an E for je, ES for tu, E for il, elle, on. For vous, remember it's so easy because it ends in EZ. And for il, elle, plural, we add en, te. So now we're just left with our new form. And this is what we need to talk about with GER verbs. So GER verbs are just that. They're still ER verbs, except they end in GER. That's the only difference. And the only difference with conjugating them is you keep that E in the new form. You keep the E. So I'm going to write my E in yellow so that way we see it. So I keep that E. And now I just add on the regular ER verb endings that we already learned. I add on that ONS. So all I do is keep that E and add ONS. And that's it for GER verbs. That's the only difference. The reason that you keep that E is because of it sounding like mangon when you drop the E. That E makes it sound mangeons. It's a lot nicer and easier to say. So it just becomes mangeons instead of, if we lose that E, mangon, right? So we want to make sure that we keep it. So now let's talk about CER verbs. So that verb up there, commencer, if we take off that R, it kind of looks like commence in English. And so when you commence something in English, you are starting something. So commencer is the verb to start, as in I'm going to start learning GER and CER verbs. Now we're going to go through and write our stem just like we would for regular ER verbs. So remember we take off that ER and we're left with our stem. So we're going to write our stem down for all 6 subjects. If you've got a sheet of paper out and you want to follow along, now would be a good time to start writing them down. And this one's kind of a long stem. right, so now I've got all of my stems written down. We're going to go through just like we did for manger and write down our regular ER verb endings. So for je, we add e. For tu, we add es. Il, elle, on ajoute e, we add e. We're going to skip the new form for right now and go straight to vous. Remember, vous is so easy because it adds ez. And then lastly, il and elle plural, we add e and te. All right, so now we just need to worry about the new form. So like I said earlier, you guys know 90% of this. It's just one of those forms that's a little wonky. So for CER verbs in the new form, the only difference is that you add an accent. So if we don't add an accent to this and we just have our ONS on the end, it's pronounced comment con, because remember that C makes a K sound, like commence. So that C makes a K sound. So if we add an accent onto it, if we add a CD, it becomes an S sound. So instead of being comment con, it's pronounced commençons. Remember, anytime we have a C with that CD on it, it makes a sound like a snake. So instead of comment con, it's pronounced commençons. So all we do after we add that accent is add our ONS ending. So the only difference with CER verbs and ER verbs is that you add that accent in the new form. And then the only difference with GER verbs instead of ER verbs is that in the new form you keep that E and then add your ending onto the end. All right, hopefully GER and CER verbs are super easy to understand, especially after we went over regular ER verbs and those endings. Like I said, you already know all of the endings. The only difference is knowing whether you keep that E or whether you add or don't add an accent. C'est tout et à plus.